So thanks for the introduction. It's great to be here today. I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about what I work on, which is sort of algae biotechnology. And the title is Photosynthetic Bio-manufacturing, Food and Fuel for the 21st Century. At first, though, I want to kind of set the stage with what I consider sort of the tipping point that we're at right now. And none of this will be a surprise to anybody, but I just want to kind of highlight maybe the urgency of what I think we need to do. So let's start with the basics. Here's world fossil energy consumption over the last 200 years. And I think the amazing thing for me when I look at this, even though we all know this, right? We all know that we've burned incredible amounts of fossil fuel and we haven't done it for very long. But it's really shocking to think we didn't really start this in earnest till about the middle of the 18th century. And then in the last 200 years, we are going to burn through about 400 million years of accumulated hydrocarbons, either in the form of crude oil and natural gas or in coal, right? During that same time, and actually sort of pretty tightly correlated with this as a cause and effect, the worldwide GDP per capita has increased astronomically. In fact, in the United States, 2021 per capita GDP is going to be about $56,000. So we're all one percenters here, right? But the same has happened for the rest of the world. The kind of interesting thing I think you'll see on this slide is China, and India is actually coming right behind it. They really had very low economic growth really until about 20 years ago, and then they really got in gear, okay? So that did a couple of amazing things for the planet. Some amazing like this, in the sense that we dropped worldwide poverty phenomenally. I mean, in 1820, 94% of the people on this planet were living in poverty. 84% were living in extreme poverty. And extreme poverty means you have so little money, you don't know where your next meal is coming from, let alone have a hard structure over your head at night. So really, in terms of, human suffering, fossil fuels had a fantastic impact on that. But of course, there's no free lunch. They had impacts on a lot of other things as well. And we'll talk about those, right? So just to kind of put this in perspective, right? Here is just world energy use, but this could also just be resource use over the last 10,000 years. And that's the little blue line. And then overlaid on top of that is world population. That's the red line. So I think when you see these two things, it's pretty clear to tell that what utilization of fossil energy has done for us is taken us from less than 1 billion people in 1800s to close to 8 billion people today, and 8 billion rich people. Okay, so what are the consequences? Well, first of all, rich people love to drive cars, right? We all have cars. Everybody has one. Some people have 2 or 3. And we love to fly in airplanes all around the world, go to all those beautiful, pristine places. And of course, by flying there and visiting them, turn them into not pristine places anymore, right? The other thing is that rich people tend to eat more animal protein. This is a graph of gross domestic product. So basically how rich you are as a country. And then on the y-axis, what percent of your protein comes from animal sources. And what you can see is the richer you are, the more animal proteins you eat. Why? Because humans like animal proteins. We like hamburgers, we like sushi, we like bacon and fish. We like all animal proteins. So when you don't have much money, like the groups down on the bottom left, Indonesia and Bangladesh, you tend to get your protein from plant sources, which also turns out to be a much more efficient way to get proteins in humans than taking that protein and running it through an animal. Well, what the hell? Because we're all rich and we're all living like kings anyway, let's make life really easy and never wash a dish again, right? And this is really what we've done to the planet in the last 60 years, really 40 years. We really kicked plastics into high gear. I think that picture on the left is one of the most amazing ones for me, right? Because what we do is we take fruit, which comes in a natural, sort of package, it's skin, and then we cut the skin off and then we put it back into a new plastic package. It's convenient, it's cheap, right? And then the bottom right one is, I'm sure you guys all know this, Starbucks or any other of the coffee companies, right? I stopped this morning and got a coffee on my way in. That is non-biodegradable, non-recyclable. It's paper coated with plastic. Well, what could possibly go wrong, right? Well, for one thing, we have changed the climate. 2020, last year, was the hottest year ever recorded. In July of this year, last month, was the hottest month we've ever recorded on this planet. I think the wildfires burning now in the West, in California and Oregon, the floods in Germany, the hurricane that just came through Louisiana, and the other one that came through New York. We see these things. This is brought about by burning fossil fuel. It is undeniable, although a lot of people still deny it. Okay? Here's one that people probably haven't recognized quite as much, and that's the incredible amount of deforestation that's gone on really in the last decade, primarily to plant corn and soybean so that we can feed those to chickens and pigs, because people around the world are getting richer, not just in the United States and Europe now, China, India, every place else. And as their income increases, they eat more animal protein. That animal protein has got to be fed plant proteins, and that means that we're cutting down rainforests to farm those things. And here's the one, and this is a personal peeve to me, and a bit I will spend talking in the rest of this talk, and that is we now have a planet covered in plastic trash. Why? Because it's cheap, it's convenient, and it was designed to never biodegrade. 17 trillion pounds of plastic on this planet today, 2,600 pounds for every man, woman, and child alive. And about 18 billion pounds of plastic flows into the ocean every year. That central picture is a picture I took back in 2018 when I was on vacation in the Maldives, which are a little set of islands between India and Africa. Very pristine, beautiful place, but many of the little deserted islands were covered in dead flip-flops and plastic water bottles. The picture on the upper left-hand corner is similar. This was a study done by a group in Australia where they went to an island 1,000 miles off the west coast of Australia, again, a little uninhabited island, to find out, hey, how much plastic is there? And what they found out that it was about 17 inches deep around the entire island. And I just think that has to change. So there are solutions to these problems. We just don't happen to like any of them. Because the fundamental problem is we put ourselves in an enormous hole, right? And that is brought about by the number of people, 8 billion people, times the amount we consume, whether it's fossil energy or cars or shoes, times the efficiency of that production. And we can impact any one of those, right? And probably at least stop digging, right? What's the first law of holes? If you find yourself in a hole, the first thing to do is stop digging. And we seem to be unable to do that, right? So I can't impact the number of people. I can try to convince people to consume less, but the one thing I can do is I can work on the efficiency of production. And those really in a couple of different places that I think about. So the first thing I want to talk about is, why do we need, a new platform? Why are we talking about new, more efficient ways to produce things? When you think about it, the agriculture, even the manufacturing, agriculture is at least 10,000 years old on this planet. Really hasn't changed much in the last 10 or 12,000 years. Yeah, we've become more efficient. We industrialized it. We brought in lots of mechanical equipment, but we still grow the same plants in more or less the same way. And many of those are not very efficient at producing the food we need. Same is also true of the way we manufacture lots of stuff. So what I've been thinking about, actually for the last 35 years now, is could we use algae as the conversion engine to make new products? That's really what biomanufacturing is all about. So what is photosynthetic biomanufacturing? That's where we use sunlight and CO2. CO2 put out by fossil fuels, filling the atmosphere. Hey, maybe we capture that inside of algae and turn it into products. And what could those products be? Well, today I'll tell you they can be almost anything. They could be biofuels. They could be plastics. They could be animal feed. They could be pharmaceuticals. You name it. We get to engineer those little engines, those little photosynthetic engines, to make whatever we want. So why do we think about algae compared to other systems? I think there's several things that we have to consider. The first is productivity. How efficient are they? And I'll show you algae are incredibly efficient compared to terrestrial plants or compared to other platforms that we can use. Obviously, even if something is productive, it still has to be scalable. You know, how are we going to get it to world scale? And I think what the one picture in the upper left-hand corner is set to imply is that we can do these things in salt water. So we can go to pretty big scale. And because it's photosynthetic, that's agriculture, we can go to agriculture scale. Sustainable simply means doesn't do us any good if we have a nice platform if we use up some other limiting resource. And the beautiful thing about algae is we can grow these things in brackish or salt water. Programmable, we'll talk about that. That's obviously what JGI is all about. Can we program cells? And then conveniently, many algae are edible. And so that's going to be an important consideration, I think, going forward. Okay, so when we say algae are the most productive photosynthetic organisms on the planet, what does that really mean? Well, there's a couple of different ways we can look at this. In agriculture, you quite often talk about productivity in tons per acre per year, right? And what's shown on the left panel is biomass in metric tons per acre per year. The most productive plant by far is sugarcane. And sugarcane, you can get up to about 25 tons per acre per year, with about 20% of that being sugar. So that's a pretty efficient system. Things like corn are down about a third of that. And if you look at algae, we can hit, I mean, in theory, you could hit 100 metric tons per acre. But right now we have algae that are hovering between 45 and 50 tons per acre. So just in terms of overall biomass, they simply outperform every other system. And that, by the way, is not because they do different photosynthesis. It's because once you get a photosynthetic organism in water, you can increase the amount of CO2, which, believe it or not, for plants is rate limiting, right? Okay, but there's another way to look at this, and this is we can look at the products that we're actually going to make. And two that I think about a lot, and most people I think about when they look at algae, are either oil or protein. So if you look at sort of the state of the art, the most productive oil crop out there is palm, and palm will produce about 650 gallons of oil per acre per year. Algae can hit at least 8 or 10 times that, right? The other one is protein, and I think this one is the one that is really important, could have the biggest impact on the planet. And that's the sort of world champion for protein right now is soybean, grown all over the world, and it only produces about 350 pounds of protein per acre per year. Algae can hit easily 20 or 40 times that. We can get things as high as 10,000 pounds per acre per year in algae. It is really a champ at making proteins and oils. Okay, so having said that, well, what are we going to produce? And originally, of course, what we thought was, hey, you know, since petroleum comes from algae, let's make biofuels from that. The problem with that is even though they're incredibly high volume, they're really low cost, right? Even though we complain about gasoline at $4 a gallon, that's less than 50 cents a kilogram, right? The other end of that spectrum, we have things like therapeutic proteins, which might be as much as $1 million a kilogram for some anti-cancer drugs that we use right now. But of course, the world supply of those is maybe 200 kilograms. So we want to look at things, I think, between those two extremes and kind of find the sweet spot for algae. And the two things that I think about right now are, can we use algae as protein for food, or can we use it for food? It could be the oils in it as well. And can we use it for polymers? Is there a way that we can sort of address this plastic pollution using this platform? Okay, so we did make, you know, biofuels from algae. Petroleum is fossil algae oil, doesn't come from something else. It's not melted dinosaurs. It's not geological formation. Petroleum crude oil is simply ancient fossil algae oil. So can we do that in real time? These are actually pictures from my lab. This is not what it would look like at giant scale, but in general, the process is the same. You grow the algae, again, sunlight and CO2, harvest the algae, split it sort of into the protein and carbohydrate portion that can go off for animal feed. You separate the oil component, concentrate that down a little bit, and then that crude oil can go directly to an existing oil refinery and can produce drop-in fuels. And in fact, we did that over the last 10 or 12 years. We made biodiesel, we made jet fuel, we made all kinds of different fuel. Works really great. The problem is that it's simply too expensive, right? This is an analysis we did back in 2009 when we were really sort of gearing up to see if we could make biofuels from algae. And what we sort of predicted was we said, hey, just by bioprospecting, we'll get better strains. And we'll take the price from, at that time, it was about $21 a gallon. We'll get this down to about, $6 or $7 a gallon. And by and large, we did that. Then we said by improving in the engineering, the way we grow them, and then also by breeding and selection, we'll make improvements. And then finally, we'll have co-products, meaning we'll sell the protein or the carbohydrate portion, and that'll, again, drive the price down. The same way this is done in agriculture. And we were on a really good path to do that. I think by 2014, we were down at less than $6 a gallon. And a company I had started called Sapphire Energy was actually negotiating with Exxon and the Saudis to put in a giant facility over in Saudi Arabia to grow algae exactly for this, right? And then what happened is we started the oil wars. Well, by we, I mean Russians and Saudi Arabia decided they were going to pump a lot more oil because the Americans and their fracking was starting to put a dent into their supplies. So they started a war, and the price of oil went from $100 a barrel down to $30 a barrel by 2015. And so the investment in biofuels really dried up. But at the same time, electric cars started to come out. So really it became a question of, well, do we really want to grow algae to make these beautiful, oils and proteins and then burn it as fuel? And we decided that's probably not what we wanted to do with it, that there were more valuable products we could use, that we could make from our algae biomass. So what might those be? And now I'm just going to tell you a little bit about two of them. This one I think is by far the most important one. And I will spend less time talking on it because it's not my personal passion so much anymore as the bioplastics are. But I think this is the one that will actually have and potentially will have the biggest impact on the planet. And that is if we can get algae for food and nutrition, right? So obviously we can, because already there is existing markets, about $15 billion today, of using microalgae as nutritional supplements. This is primarily spirulina, chlorella, Haematococcus. There's several that are grown out there now. They're primarily used for, what we would call nutraceuticals, meaning sort of high value, expensive supplements that you add to shakes or smoothies or whatever. Quite a bit of algae is also used for vitamin production or for the DHA omega-3 fatty acids. But obviously these things are already sold as food. I think the challenge is, can we get these to become bulk food, right? Okay, so why would we use algae as bulk food? Well, as I had said before, algae are really good at producing protein. There are some algae that will get to 70 or 75% of their biomass as protein. The other kind of thing that's very nice about them is they tend to be very balanced in their amino acid. And I shouldn't be generalizing, I am. There are all kinds of different algae. There are more species of algae on the planet than there are plants by far. And they run the spectrum. They're found in every ecological niche. You can get some algae that are very high in carbohydrate, low in protein. But in general, if you select the right ones, you can get ones that are rich in protein and that have a very nice balanced amino acid composition. And that protein is very digestible, meaning that animals or humans can consume it and get very good protein benefit out of it. This happens to be the analysis of one of the green algae that I work on called Chlamydomonas reinhardti. It's almost 50% protein. Soybeans, as I said, the sort of gold standard out there for protein, is only about 38%, better amino acid composition than soybean, and also rich in the omega-3 fatty acids, essential fatty acids, as well as in vitamin A, iron, calcium. So really kind of very well, nice balanced food, okay? Well, if you're going to sell algae as a food, you actually have to have USDA approval of that. Most things that have generally recognized as safe status, meaning that you can buy them in the grocery store, those were grandfathered in. So things like potatoes and rice and corn and beef and chicken, we all knew those were safe. We've been eating them for hundreds of years. So obviously those got grandfathered in. But if you have a new food that you want to introduce, like a green algae people haven't seen before, well, the FDA says, hey, you know what? You better go and prove to us that this is safe. It's not a hard process to go through. It's a little bit cumbersome, right? But by and large, what you do is you start by identifying that there aren't any toxins or adverse substances in it. You feed mice, you feed pigs, and eventually you work your way up to feeding humans. So we did that. We got GRAS status, and we actually ran a human trial on our green algae back in the summer of 2018. And specifically what we looked for are, what did it taste like? Did people like it? And one of the interesting things that came out of this, and we had a good indication of this actually from our mouse and pig trials, was that algae turned out to be really good for something called irritable bowel syndrome. So about 15 to 20% of people have this. It basically means you have an upset stomach, sometimes diarrhea. And what we found out was that people who had IBS and ate our green algae showed a dramatic improvement in their digestive health. They had less gas, they had less diarrhea, felt better. So I think this one is actually on its way to being a human nutraceutical. I think the last kind of challenge we have for this thing is, can we really get the price down? And if we do, I think this will be a game changer for the planet. I'm sure many of you know what these things are: Impossible Burgers, Beyond Burgers, engineered food, right? This is where people have taken plant proteins, which are way more efficient than beef at making protein, and then textured those and formulated those so that they feel and taste like a hamburger. So an Impossible Burger is wheat protein, coconut oil, potato proteins, and what they claim, and I'm sure they're right about this, is compared to beef, you'll get about a 96% reduction in the amount of land it takes to make that burger, 87% reduction in the fresh water you use, and about 90% fewer greenhouse gas emission. So I tell my students, if you want to do something for the planet immediately, that's super easy to do, stop eating hamburgers and start eating plant burgers. And the taste is not that different anymore. So remember, this is if they made these things with plant proteins. Algae are 10 times more efficient, maybe 20 times more efficient than soybean. If we could use algae to make textured animal proteins like this, and we could change, the diet of humans from eating cows and pigs to eating textured vegetable proteins, we would go an enormous way to reducing climate change on this planet. The biggest problem for it, it's still a little too expensive. Algae comes in at about $5 or $6 a kilogram. We need to get that down to less than $2 a kilogram. Part of that we'll get by improving engineering systems, and a big part of it will simply come of economies of scale as we start to scale these things up. And that's happening now. It's happening too slow for me, but it's definitely happening. Okay, so I want to spend the last sort of 15 minutes or so talking about something that is near and dear to my heart, which is, can we actually make biodegradable plastics, biodegradable polymers? And this came about because, as I said, petroleum comes from algae. So plastics come from petroleum. Petroleum comes from algae. Therefore, the thesis was pretty simple. We should be able to make plastics from algae. So the idea is you have CO2 in the atmosphere. You have these very efficient organisms, algae, which capture that CO2, convert it into oil. And then rather than taking that oil and burning it for, as biofuels, we take that and convert it into polymers. And if we do that right, we'll make those polymers so that they biodegrade at the end of their useful life. One of the things that people have often ask me, and I think that this is something that all of us need to think about, and that is, when we started to make plastics, the idea was, let's make them so they last forever. And I think it wasn't that chemists were evil people that wanted to accumulate plastic trash on the planet over the next 50 years. They simply weren't making the calculation that, maybe we want the material that we build something out of to have a half-life that's proportional to the product. In other words, why would we make a shoe which is only going to last 2 or 3 years out of materials that is going to last 1,000 years? So we want to see, maybe let's change that. Maybe let's make products out of materials that have a half-life that's proportional to the product. Okay, so we looked around and we said, okay, we've got algae oil. We know we can pretty much make any plastic out of that we want, but what polymer should we start on? And when we looked at this, a couple of them jumped right out. Almost all plastics that are abundant are not biodegradable, and very few of them are recyclable. Talk about that in just a second. But 2 of them, and those are the polyester polyurethanes, and then things like PLA and PHB, these are naturally biodegradable. So the polyester or the urethane bonds occur in nature. And if a bond occurs in nature, then it's very likely that there's an organism that can eat it, right? And because they can be biodegraded, they can also be recycled, depolymerized and recycled. Traditional plastics, things like ethyl vinyl acetate, EVA, or polyethylene terephthalate water bottles, these are not biodegradable, but they are recyclable by melting and recasting them. But because every time you melt them and recast them, you degrade the quality of the material a little bit, it turns out that they're really only recyclable up to, like water bottles, maybe 20%, something like that. But in practice, we're down in the single digits, something 7 or 8%. And for most things, we don't recycle them at all, okay? So we said, well, let's go for, rather than recycling, let's go for biodegradable, okay? All right, so what can you make with polyurethanes? So polyurethanes are pretty simple chemistry. What you have is an alcohol group, and you need more than one of them because you're going to polymerize these guys together. And that alcohol group reacts with an isocyanate group to form a urethane bond. So what you need is a diisocyanate. So you need a molecule that has isocyanate groups on either side or multiple of them. And then you need a carbon chain that's got more than one alcohol. And when those things link together, you will form a polyurethane. And what are polyurethanes? Polyurethanes are everywhere. Polyurethanes are car tires, they're shoes, they're surfboards, they're coatings on floors, they're plastic coatings. So there are lots of things you can make out of polyurethanes. Polyols are the easier part of the polymer to make. So they're the one half of the monomer, and what the polyol is it's a long carbon chain with alcohols on either end. And alcohols are pretty common, pretty easy to make. The isocyanates are much tougher to make. That's the reactive part of the molecule. The isocyanate spontaneously reacts with an alcohol to form the polyurethane bond. If that polyol is long and linear, you tend to make flexible foams. And if that polyol, they're branched or there's a big number of them, then you tend to cross-link those things and make rigid foams. So the actual first foams we made were rigid foams, and we did this. We simply took triacylglycerides from algae. We did an epoxidation and a ring opening, so we had multiple hydroxyl groups on those carbon chains. And when we cross-linked those with toluene diisocyanate, which is a very common isocyanate used in lots of polyurethanes, we could make some polyurethane foams. And we made the first ones of these back in 2014. So we saw, oh, we can take our algae oil and we can turn this into polyurethane. So we kind of got off to a good start there. Then over the next year or two, we improved the formulation on that. And the formulation is all the other different additives you have to put into it, right? It's the surfactants, it's the catalyst, it's the cross-linkers, you name it. And eventually we got to the point where we could make pretty good rigid foams. And we actually made a surfboard out of those. And that little surfboard went viral, and it used to have its own calendar. It used to travel all around the world on itself. But because of that, we were contacted by a number of shoe companies to ask us, hey, if you can make rigid foams, can you make soft foams? So the next thing we set about was to see if we could make flexible polyurethanes. And there's really kind of two reasons for this. Surfboards, although they were a cool product, there's only about 500,000 of those made every year on the planet, and each one contains about 1 kilogram of material. So you can kind of see maybe 500,000 kilograms. There are 25 billion pairs of shoes. Lord knows how many tires, mattresses, you name it. So we really knew that if we wanted to impact the planet, it was going to be with flexible foams. And so what we did was we took our algae oils, and then through a process called ozonolysis, we clipped that down and made a diacid out of that fatty acid. So we broke that at the double bond, and that formed a carboxylic acid when that broke. And then mixing that with either PDO or BDO, so two different propane diol or butane diol, we could make polyester polyols, long linear ones. And when we mix those with MDI, we could get very nice flexible foams. And we showed this about 2 years ago, that we can make very nice flexible foams with that. So that sort of took care of the polyol portion of it. Then we also wanted to address, well, could we actually make, bio-based isocyanates? So we could make the entire molecule, the entire polyurethane from algae oils. You can do this if you have a diacid, and this one is the azelaic acid is what we actually made from our fatty acids. So that's a 9-carbon dicarboxylic acid. And you can treat that with thionyl chloride and then form azelaic diazide, and then by a Curtius rearrangement, convert this into an isocyanate. And this was work done by Mike Burkhardt and his group here at UC San Diego. But the problem with that is, one, that's very caustic. Thionyl chloride is a very caustic chemical. And then when you form the azelaic diazide, it's actually explosive. So what Mike and his team worked out was, could they do this in flow chemistry? So it's not that the chemistry is hugely different, but you do this in very small scale to where you're continuously flowing the two reagents together so that you never build up a large amount of this before it's converted. So you sort of have azelaic acid, as an input, a variety of other reactants go in there, and then popping out the other end, we got this nice heptamethylene diisocyanate. So it's a linear or aliphatic diisocyanate. So that one turns out to be really good for making coatings, not very good for making foams. But Mike went on to look at, well, okay, if I can do that with the diacid, how many different diacids can I actually use here to make isocyanates? And every single one on here, Mike's group was able to convert from a biological source into a diisocyanate, including some that are identical to MDI, right? Okay, so we've now been able to make polyols, and we've been able to make diisocyanates. So now the challenge really switched to, yes, but can we make those at big scale, right? And so what we wanted to think about was, could we engineer algae? Not just to make a little bit of these, but to make a lot of these. So could we actually engineer these cells? And this is a collaboration between UC San Diego and two labs, Pacific Northwest National Lab and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, under what's called the, well, we call it our Advanced Algal Biofoundry. I think they just call it their Advanced Biofoundry. And what we attempted to do was to use the capabilities of PNNL for the machine learning and the computational aspects of this, and then LBNL and their library synthesis to actually design and build cells that could produce higher levels of these. We picked several different precursors that we went after, but an important one is called succinic acid. Like I said, this is a diacid. It's a 4-carbon diacid. We could make any number of diacids or diols that will be usable for polyurethanes. And this is simply showing that over the last couple of years now, we've been able to reach titers as high as 5 grams per liter. That's not quite commercial sort of levels yet. We're going to need to get to about 20 to 40 grams per liter, but we think we're on a pretty good path to get there, to actually take cells, photosynthetic now, and use these to produce precursors for polyurethanes. Okay, so in addition to sort of working on the basic cell biology and chemistry, we also wanted to formulate these into real products. So we didn't just want to make, sort of in the lab, experiments. We actually wanted to take these out and turn these into real products. And that part of the process is called formulation. So we actually started a company called Algenesis Materials. We send them our monomers. And these guys formulate these into all sorts of different products. Specifically right now, we've been concentrated on midsoles and outsoles for either running shoes or flip-flops or casual shoes. We've now managed to hit commercial specification for these things. We have shoes that meet the standard of Nike or Adidas or any other company on the planet. Importantly, why we were doing all of this chemistry and formulation, we made certain that we kept the chemistry such that they would be biodegradable at the end of their life. So it's one thing to sort of theoretically say they should be, because we know we have only polyester and urethane bonds, and that we haven't put any compounds into this that would block biodegradation. But just last summer, we were able to show that foams that met specification for flip-flops and running shoes, in fact, would biodegrade in either soil or compost. So this is not industrial biodegradation. This is home biodegradation. You can actually take our shoes and throw them into your compost pile at the end of their life. And in about 4 to 6 months, they will completely biodegrade. We're working now to identify both the organisms that degrade them, the processes that degrade them, so that we can, accelerate this or slow it down. So you don't want these things to degrade when you're on your feet, but when you're done with them, you want them to degrade very quickly. So we're trying to understand the entire process so that we can control that very precisely. And so far, it's looking very good. It looks like we can keep these things from degrading while they're on your feet and then have them degrade very quickly at the end of their useful life. So we've actually managed to make prototype products of these. Here's a flip-flop that we developed in our lab. We've now licensed this technology to one of the world's biggest flip-flop companies. They're actually in large-scale production with these materials over in Indonesia. We have also developed a shoe where we have the midsole and the upper is made of biodegradable canvas. And we're testing these right now as prototypes with the idea that these things will be on the market within the next 4 or 5 months, I think. It's looking good right now. COVID obviously has set us back a little bit, but right now we're looking very good for a launch of both of these products before Christmas. Okay, so where do we go from here? I think we have to, as a society, do a couple of different things. We have to get much more efficient at the way we produce things, and we have to stop consuming things that we really don't need. We have to stop buying 5 different pairs of shoes because we like the different colors. When I was a kid, my father had a little expression: use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without. I don't know where that came from, probably someplace during the Depression. I have no idea, but it's really what we have to get back to. I think if we can make synthetic animal proteins, Impossible Burgers, Beyond Burgers, you name it, and do those from algae, I think this is going to be a game changer for the planet. And then I also think biodegradable plastics are also essential.
Down to 6 minutes.
Yep, that's my last slide. So I think if we can get biodegradable plastics, I think they're also essential for the planet. I think flip-flops are a really good way to start. And I hope that these things will be on the market very soon. So thank you very much for your attention. I will stop sharing. Let's see. And let's see if it'll let me come back on here.
Yeah,
it is still
want to try cycling your camera, Steve. Maybe turn it off and on again and see if we had it working earlier.
I know. And I'm hitting the little button over here that says your camera is on, but I can tell it's not because my little green light and my camera's off. Let me see if there's another way. Is there any other way to input?
Do you have the correct camera selected in the input box?
Yeah, I'm looking. It's just not, yeah, I click on it and it says, sorry, Ian, it says, I click on it and it pops up and says, your camera is on, but I can tell it's not because I don't see myself and I don't see a picture of it and I don't see any other way.
We've got a lot of questions, so I'm gonna kick things off on the questions if that's okay.
Yep, you fire on the questions and I'll see if I can find any other button to turn my camera on.
All right. So the first question is, how do algae compare to others? And I'm assuming others is bioenergy crops here. So how do algae compare to other bioenergy crops when biomass productivity is normalized to cost?
Yeah, so when you normalize it to cost, they are not competitive right now. But there's really 2 reasons. But that's not because they're not more efficient. It's because if we think about most crops, they've been around, many of them have been around for 10,000 years. And certainly for the last 100 years, we have focused on getting these things to hyper efficiency. If you look at corn, it has an efficiency improvement of about 1 or 1.5% every year. But when you multiply that over 100 years, and when you look at the scale that we've gone to, 100 million acres in the United States, that's just an economy of scale that we cannot compete with yet. But it's an economy of scale that we have the opportunity to reach. So still in its infancy, it's kind of like the computers were 30 or 40 years ago, not very efficient now, but they have the potential to become enormously efficient.
So back in the 2010s, mid 2010s, there was a lot of talk about transitioning away from a reliance of algae for biofuels and offsetting the costs with high value products.
Yeah.
But maybe this is a consequence of electrification of transport, but it sounds from your presentation like really the future is with foods or high value biomaterials. So do you see a future for algae and biofuels at this point, or is it more about those high value products?
Well, I think if you look at the history of how any product is developed, you never start with a commodity, right? Like we were silly to think we were going to go to fuels, right? Even the oil industry didn't do that, right? They started making kerosene for lamps. And if you look at photovoltaics, which is one of my favorite ones, 40, 50 years ago, these things were several $100s a watt. And it took time and economy of scale and invention to get to where they're a commodity thing. So no product is ever developed where we start at commodity. It always starts at a high value product. And then over time, we improve the efficiency, we increase the scale. Both of those things drive the cost down. And then at some point, you get to a cost that you can do commodity products.
Excellent. So another question here. Somebody in the audience is not particularly fond of the taste of Impossible Burgers. So is there the potential to improve those taste qualities using algae?
Yes. So where it has its biggest impact is because it has the omega-3s, and omega-3s have the not unpleasant part of a fish taste is the omega-3s often. So there's certainly algae have the opportunity. We can get tasteless, colorless protein, which is what the big food companies always want. What they want is protein that is white and has no taste, so they can put any flavor into it they want. Yes, we can do that, but honestly, you can get used to Impossible Burgers. They're not that bad.
All right, another question here. Do you routinely analyze whether it is more cost-effective or even achievable to use genetic engineering versus chemicals to obtain a precursor stroke chemical?
Yeah, I think we're going to use both of them. I think the idea that, we use one to the exclusion of the other is kind of not looking at the problem in the right way. Having said that, there are no products that we consume right now, I don't care if it's animal or plant, that are not enormously genetically modified. We just didn't do it with precise ways. We did it by breeding, we did it by mutagenesis, we did it by selection. We're still changing the genomes. So this idea that foods are not GMO, yes, they are. All foods are genetically modified. We just did it by breeding and mutagenesis, not the precise kind of genetic engineering that we can do today. In the future, we're going to do precise genetic engineering. We understand genomes better. Thank you, JGI. We understand how to manipulate them better. Again, thank you, JGI. And that's what we're going to do in the future.
All right, fantastic. So another question here is, have you considered taking dyes from microbes and combining that with the bioplastics from algae to create colored plastics?
Yes, we've started that. They're still expensive too, and they tend to fade in the sunlight. So, and then one of the disadvantages we have, if we put in UV stabilizers, some of those UV stabilizers inhibit biodegradation. We kind of know that. We don't know why yet. But yes, we absolutely consider it. That is certainly going to be the future. We need more people working on it. Whoever asked that question, tell me when you're working on it, and we'll collaborate with you.
All right. Seeing one more question here. With the goal of decreasing the cost of producing algal biomass at scale, what are the immediate challenges that you think could be addressed with SynBio? For instance, is large-scale cultivation or pathway efficiency a bigger challenge?
I think large-scale cultivation right now is the biggest challenge. I think pathway engineering gets you for your specific product. But in order for us to get to big scale, we have to sort of get over the hurdle of how do we get to really large scale. One of the things we know, right, is that the algae that are at really large scale right now are extremophiles. So they either grow in high salt or high pH. And if you get them into that thing, not very many other things compete with them. So what we did over the last 2 years is identify green algae that are extremophiles, or we selected them. We're not sophisticated enough to engineer high salt and high pH tolerance into it, but we can select it. So we now have several of our green algae that grow at pH 10.5 and 300 millimolar sodium chloride. And when you put them in those conditions, not much else survives out there. I think that's going to be enormously helpful to get us to large scale. At the same time, we're parallel processing those guys to do the precise engineering to make the product we want, whether it's succinic acid or fatty acid or a high value protein.
All right. Well, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Steve.